Hello BookTube. A couple quick notes at the beginning. First of all, I'm filming this over the 4th of July weekend. There are fireworks going off in the neighborhood. So if you hear them in the background, that's what they are. Sorry, can't do anything about them. Secondly, in my previous video, Sargon, King of Battle, I misspoke slightly. I said that Sargon, King of Battle was one of 3 texts about Sargon that were still circulating in the Neo-Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian period. And that was information I got off of Wikipedia. I've double-checked it though, and I misremembered that slightly. It was one of 3 texts about Sargon's dynasty that were still circulating, not necessarily Sargon himself. And that's relevant because today I'm talking about one of the other texts from Sargon's dynasty that was circulating in the Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian period. And this is about Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. And it is called, the Cuthean legend of Naram-Sin is the name. And this is from Before the Muses by Benjamin R. Foster. So, let me back up and give some historical background on this as best I can. And as always, take everything I say with a grain of salt because I'm not an expert, but I have tried to do some research before filming this video. So, Naram-Sin was the grandson of Sargon of Akkad. So Sargon of Akkad was the founder of the Cuthaean Empire, arguably the first empire in world history. After he died, his sons succeeded him, but his sons aren't really terribly notable. But after them came Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. And Naram-Sin had a number of military victories and solidified the Cuthaean Empire at its greatest territorial extent. And in particular, Naram-Sin at one point was faced with a revolt as well as a coalition of Mesopotamian kings, which were all arrayed against him. And despite these overwhelming odds, he defeated this coalition and solidified his empire. And that was actually covered in this book during what Benjamin R. Foster calls the archaic period of Akkadian literature. And he gives a brief text describing the victories, and he notes that in later periods, this battle is going to attain mythic proportions and the enemies are going to become supernatural. And I remember reading at that time, I think I mentioned it in my previous video, where I said, okay, that's going to be interesting when we get to that. And then as well in the classical period of Akkadian literature, also from the same book, there's more documents about Naram-Sin's military campaign. And again, Benjamin R. Foster says that later on it's going to have mythical proportions and the enemies are going to become supernatural. And again, I thought, okay, well, that'll be interesting when we get to it. And here we are here in what Benjamin R. Foster calls the mature period of Akkadian literature, aka the Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian period. Babylonians and Assyrians both spoke and wrote Akkadian, so this is all Akkadian literature. Where we come to the Cuthean legend of Naram-Sin, and this is where it becomes supernatural. Cuthea is, I guess, a city in northern Babylonia where this legend is associated with. There's a Wikipedia article as well on this text, the Cuthean legend of Naram-Sin, And I've read the Wikipedia article. I'll link to it in the description down below, and I'll be incorporating some information I got from Wikipedia. In addition, there's an interesting podcast I've discovered lately called the Oldest Stories Podcast. He's also on YouTube. And he has an episode dedicated to this text and one other text. And the episode is entitled The Slanderous Legends of Naram-Sin. And I'll link to that episode in the description down below as well. And as the name of that podcast, as the name of that episode implies, The Slanderous Legends of Naram-Sin, this is a legend that is taking a negative view of Naram-Sin's legend. And as the Oldest Stories podcast explains, for various historical reasons, Naram-Sin, although he was a great military leader in his own time, his legacy became negative in later years. People, I guess, were wanting to take away from his military victories. So instead of having all these great military victories, in later years he had great military defeats. And so, yes, here we are here with the Cuthean legend of Naram-Sin. And just a quick note here. I am borrowing as well from the Oldest Stories podcast and their episode, The Slanderous Legends of Naram-Sin. I've listened through to that podcast where he retells the story of the text. And I listened through comparing that to the text that was in here before the Muses. And there do appear to be some differences. I don't know if he's getting his information from another version of the text. There are various versions, apparently. But yeah, just be aware of that, I guess, that there are differences between the version in the Oldest Stories podcast and here. Actually, even in here, there are 3 different versions. So he's got the, in this book, we have the Old Babylonian version, first of all, which is a couple pages here. And then we have the Middle Babylonian version, a couple pages here. And then the Late Assyrian version. And the Late Assyrian version is the fullest version of the text. It does have some gaps here, but it is more or less a complete story, whereas the Old Babylonian version and Middle Babylonian version appear to just be fragments here. So I guess I'm mainly going to be talking about the Late Assyrian version here. Okay. Anyways, all that preliminary out of the way. Apologies, it seems to be one of those days where I'm having trouble speaking. I get like that sometimes. All those preliminaries out of the way. Let's jump into this here. So it starts off with a rather confusing beginning, where there's some talk about Immerker's legacy. Now, who is Immerker again? He's one of the legendary Sumerian rulers of the first dynasty of Uruk. But the translator, Benjamin Foster, I guess, has a footnote here that it's actually not even certain that Immerkar is actually the subject of these opening lines, and there's scholars arguing for different translations. So either we're talking about Immerker's legacy, or I guess we're not. But if we're talking about Immerker's legacy, there's some complaints that he didn't leave a stela, like he didn't leave an inscription talking about his great deeds, and it's a pity he didn't, because perhaps later kings would have profited from his example, because he also had the judgment of the gods against him, and he's apparently suffering in the afterlife because of that. But then we get to Naram-Sin, and for whatever reason, the gods decide to produce an army against Naram-Sin. And this is an army of monsters. They're described as cave birds, humans with raven faces. And they are created by the gods, and the goddess Tiamat suckled them. Now, this is interesting because Tiamat is the goddess who's the big monster in the Enuma Elish myth. And according to the Enuma Elish myth, she is also killed by Marduk, and her body becomes, I think, the heaven and the earth after Marduk splits her in half. So I guess if we're going with that version of the myth, Tiamat was already dead before humans appeared. But I guess you just have to accept that there's many different versions of myths in Mesopotamia, and you can't try and synchronize them. So anyways, in this version, Tiamat, who is evidently still alive, is suckling the monsters. There's another god, Belet Eli, who is also nurturing them. And then when they are finally ready and become adults, there are 7 kings leading this army. And there's a list of the kings here. Oldest Stories podcast mentions that these may be connected to some loose historical kings. But at this point, they're best treated just as myth. And they start invading, starting with Anatolia, and then working their way around Mesopotamia. And the remaining kings of Mesopotamia, 17 kings with 9,000 troops, come to Naram-Sin and ask him for his help in defeating this invading army of monsters that's just killing everybody and destroying all the cities. So Naram-Sin has sacrifices performed to consult what's known as the, what are they called again? Sorry, I just had this. Ecstaspices, which I guess is the science of looking at the liver of the sacrifice to determine the will of the god, the divination. And the will of the gods is, do not fight this invading army. And Naram-Sin ignores that. He says to himself, what lion observed divination? What wolf consulted a dream interpreter? Which makes a certain amount of sense, right? The lions and the wolves go around and consulting the oracles before they attack. It's all mumbo jumbo anyways, right? Well, not according to the laws of this myth. So he launches out his first army with 120,000 troops, and not one returned alive. So then the second year he sends out 9,000 troops, and not one returns alive. And then the third year he sends out 60,700 troops, and not one returned alive. And then he goes into despair and has this existential crisis where he asks himself, what have I left for a reign? Am I a king who brings no well-being to his land? A shepherd who brings no well-being to his flock? How shall I place myself that I may bring myself out of this? And then he talks about a number of disasters. He says, fear of lions, death, plague, convulsions, panic, ague, economic collapse, starvation, want, anxiety of every kind come down with them. And when I read this the first time, I thought he was just talking about all these disasters that he was afraid of happening. But Oldest Stories podcast, when you listen to that, takes the view that these are disasters that followed. I guess, because he's still being punished by the gods. So, yeah, the Oldest Stories knows more than I do. Let's go with his version. These are disasters that followed. And then it says, above in the earth there was a deluge, meaning a great flood. And the translator's note says it compares the scourge of the host to the flood of old. So I guess, perhaps the translator here is saying that there wasn't a literal flood. It was just this supernatural army was like a flood. I don't know. I got the impression from listening to Oldest Stories podcast that it was a literal flood. Anyways, after all that, he summons the divinations again, and they do give him permission to attack. Oh! I just realized I forgot a key point in the story. Is it too late to go back? I'm going to jump back. Key point earlier in the story, right at the beginning when he's first considering whether or not to attack these monster armies, he sends out a soldier to prick one of the monster soldiers and see if they bleed. Because he's thinking, if they don't bleed, then you can't fight them. But if they bleed, then they're flesh and blood, and then they can be defeated. So the soldier goes out and pricks one of the monsters and discovers that they do in fact bleed. And so that's when Naram-Sin first considers his military campaigns against them. I forgot to mention that was earlier in the story. Okay, right, where were we now? So he gets some permission to go out, and it's a little bit confusing what happens here, but I guess there are 12 soldiers, or 12 troops, which I think means 12 soldiers, who break off from the main group and get captured by Naram-Sin's military expedition. Naram-Sin brings them back and does not kill them. He's learned his lesson. He's got to consult the gods here. So they consult the gods, and the gods say, don't kill them, because we're going to use these soldiers later for vengeance. And then the gods list how one city is going to be brought down to misery by these soldiers. And it's interesting, the imagery they use here, because it reminds me of the Old Testament prophets who are prophesying doom for a city. Because they're talking a lot of the same types of image. So, let's see. What do they say? 10 quarts of barley will cost a mina of silver. There was no strong king to govern in the land. City against city, house against house will turn. Father to father, brother to brother, man to man, companion to friend. None will tell the truth to each other. People will be taught untruth. Strange things they will learn. The city is hostile, they will kill. That hostile city, another hostile city will capture. So, prophesying this doom. And Oldest Stories podcast says that although Naram-Sin does not know what city they are prophesying the doom of, the readers of this story, being in a much later period, know what's coming, which is the fall of the city of Akkad, which was supposedly brought down by Cuthean raiders. I guess the Cutheans were a mountainous people who raided down and destroyed the city of Akkad later. So this is the doom of the city of Akkad being foretold, even though nobody knows it yet. And so, Naram-Sin obeys the will of the gods and does not harm the 12 soldiers he has captured, and does not try and defeat this monstrous host anymore. I guess they're just allowed to roam free until the time that the gods want to use them for their vengeance against some city. And then the last page here is interesting because Naram-Sin is giving his wisdom as to what he's learned from this. And it's a very turn the other cheek type morality, which is surprising to see it this long before Christ. Of course, this isn't really Naram-Sin. This was written, saying, in the mature period of Akkadian literature, the Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian period. But that still is, that still is a good, 700 years before Christ, right? That this is being written. So he says, if an enemy is raiding your land, do not go out against them. Though he drives off your livestock, do not go near him. Though he eats the flesh of your soldiers, though he murders, be moderate. Control yourself. Answer them, yes, my lord. And then, here's where this really sounds like the turn the other cheek. It says, to their wickedness, repay kindness. To their kindness, add gifts and gratifications. Avoid them whenever you can. Let expert scribes compose a stellar for you. Oh, okay. And then it kind of just ends there. So, the Oldest Stories podcast says it's just completely laughable to imagine that these words would have been in the mouth of the historical Naram-Sin, and that this kind of attitudes would have been completely out of place with the Bronze Age thinking that was the time of Naram-Sin. This is, as the Oldest Stories podcast says, a later story, which is, he uses the word slandering the memory of Naram-Sin. But it's an interesting text for a whole variety of reasons. The way the historical campaigns have morphed into supernatural campaigns against an army of monsters. The way Naram-Sin, instead of this great military genius, is now reduced to a bumbler who does everything wrong. That weird ending where Naram-Sin appears to be saying, turn the other cheek, do not repay. What's the exact quote here again? To their wickedness, repay kindness. Which is, very similar to the New Testament doctrine, right? So, that's the Cuthean legend of Naram-Sin from Before the Muses.